Hey, thanks for joining us again to continue our conversation with Pastor Robby and Kandi as we talk about this first marriage sermon. Robby, you just finished week 1 of Real Love series, and this one was really, I felt like it was foundational, setting the stage for what's to come. Is that what you were thinking too?
Yeah. I mean, there's more we could say. I mean, obviously,
Sure.
marriage is a picture of the gospel with Christ as the bridegroom and the church as the woman. I mean, obviously, we may do some more of that. But yeah, it was pretty foundational about leaving and attaching. Yes.
We asked people to text in questions that they might have had from the sermon, and we have got an overwhelming number of questions, which is
Wow.
good. It's good. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I'd like to ask you some of them if it's okay. And they're not necessarily asking one of you specifically, so just feel free to jump in
Okay.
however you want. If we could go back to the parent question, we talked a lot about separating. I think 2 points in your message where we need to separate and then attach to our spouse. Should we as parents that have married children, if our children are venting to us, how do we as parents help in that situation?
Yeah, that's a good insight. Oh, good question. So here's what I would start with. Something I didn't say, but something to consider. The Bible shows, so God gives us an order to do things. He says, but you have a choice. Here's the order, you have a choice. In the Bible, the only 2 covenants that are eternal, there's a lot of temporary contracts, 2 eternal covenants. The covenant between God and man, and then the covenant between a man and a woman. So that's the only 2 eternal covenants. Now, we have temporary covenants down here. But whenever there's problems is when the temporary covenants we have or temporary agreements we have with man and friends and parents and coworkers, when we elevate them above the eternal covenants, that's where the problem comes in.
So are you saying even the parent-child covenant is a temporary one?
Yes, I would say even a
So
temporary.
it's overseated by the marriage covenant.
Yeah, and it's a tough one because you're raising your
Sure.
kids to send them. You
Sure.
love your kids, you want the best. So I would say, to answer your question, yes, there has to be a place where you step in as the parent and say, your first love is your husband. Your first confidant is your husband. Sarah, Susie, Mike, you need to go talk to your wife or your husband.
Okay, so Kandi, let me ask you, if a spouse has a spouse that doesn't communicate or doesn't receive communication well, at times you do need someone outside to get advice from or talk about issues that you may have. Who, if you shouldn't go to your parents, who do you go to?
Yeah. I mean, I personally have a friend that lives in a different state, and she is friends with Robby and I both, knows us equally the same amount of years, and I can call her and just say, listen, you know me, and you know Robby, and and I've had to do this a few times, very rarely, but and ask her for honest. Like, if it's me, tell me, or whatever. How am I looking at this? And I trust her to do that. She's a godly Christian woman. So I think, you need somebody that you can talk to and process with at some point, but not at the neglect of talking to your spouse.
And
Let
Robby,
me add one thing too.
Yeah.
What I mean is, you should talk to your parents. I talk to my parents about a lot of things. You shouldn't be venting to your parents and complaining to your parents. Now, if you're seeking guidance and insight, hey, Mom, we have a challenge with finances. Can you help us?
Well,
That's
yes,
different.
absolutely.
I'm talking about the girl or guy who's constantly calling and venting.
just telling the negative.
Just the negative
Right.
all the time, because like I said in the sermon,
Yeah.
the mom is not privy to the reconciliation. Another thing, Kandi, is a great point. You have to have godly men and women in your life,
Yes.
not just men and women. There's a lot of guys at your office that have a lot of information they'll give liberally.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of information you want to lead your marriage. So you need to discern who you're listening, test every spirit.
And it's probably key too that the friend you talked about is a married female,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
not
absolutely.
someone
That's
of
key.
the opposite sex.
Absolutely. I would never, and if you're married, you should never, ever be calling someone of the opposite sex to give you marital advice. That's a recipe for disaster. You're inviting problems if you do that. You should never be doing that. Unless it's your brother. That's it.
Yeah, your
That's
brother.
it. There's no reason for
who
it.
is godly and has a great marriage.
Right.
maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Exactly,
but
yeah.
never should be.
Okay, then how do you lovingly, biblically set boundaries with parents if they don't understand the separation principle?
Say that again.
How do you, if you have parents that don't understand the separation principle,
Okay.
how do you lovingly set boundaries with them?
Yeah. I mean, I think in my situation where my mom was like, hey, I don't want you kind of moving away, it took a conversation of like, hey, wait a second, Mom. Like, we know this is what's supposed to happen. And she absolutely agreed with that. But it just took a conversation of us saying, hey, let's keep perspective. This is what, we know that this is what God is calling us to do. And, praise God, my mom was like, absolutely. I totally support you, and I support Robby and y'all's marriage and what God's, calling you to do. But sometimes it just takes, you have to have that conversation and communicate what the Lord is calling you to do and how you see that fitting with your marriage, and that you need the support of your parents, your in-laws. You need the support of that for you all to be successful.
Yeah, and the point I was making earlier is you can talk to them about stuff, but you cannot nurture a relationship with your spouse if you're constantly straddling the fence with your parents. So it's the Velcro illustration. You need to unattach the Velcro from your parents and attach the Velcro to your spouse.
Yeah.
You can't straddle both parent and spouse. And that's why what I'm getting at is that's why some marriages are where they are today.
And listen, so like I had, like my grandmother, okay, my dad's mom my dad was her baby. And so she was overbearing and just very, and she would just tell my mom some of the meanest things. Now, I absolutely love my grandmother. We were super close. And my mom would, kind of tell her things back. It was like, they just would have it out sometimes, and they loved each other, but my grandmother wanted my dad to support her and not support my mom. And my dad never did it. My dad always stuck by my mom, and he would say, Mama, and he would tell his mom just how it was, But they had a relationship like that for years where they loved each other, but my grandmother was just going to say things just to be mean,
Yeah.
So you have to, but my dad supported my mom, and that's what he should have done, And I think that's what more men probably need to do, is stick to their wife, support the wife, and let the mom know, if she's overstepping boundaries.
Well, it's very helpful for me to think of the two covenants that you said are the only permanent covenants, and that even parent-child relationship is temporary in God's eyes. Robby, let me ask you a question that has to do with addiction. A lot of people have asked about dealing with a spouse who is struggling with addiction. And someone says, we have kids together, we're married, but my spouse is in active addiction, fighting that. How do you deal with that as a spouse?
Addiction is a sin of any kind. I mean, it's we categorize sins, immorality higher than addiction, or sin. Addiction is the sin of idolatry. You could say a lot about this, but it's a sin of idolatry in the sense of you're finding joy and satisfaction from something other than the Lord. And God should be your supply and satisfaction. So it's the sin of idolatry. You're worshiping this drug. It happens to be a drug you put in your body. I would say two things. Addiction's a real issue that people battle, okay? And I think you could be, I know you can be a Christian and battle addiction. The question is he battling addiction, or is he the byproduct of the battle? Meaning, is he trying? Is he going to meetings? Or has he just thrown the white flag up and say, you know what, this is who I am, babe. If you don't like it, I'm gonna get high and I'm gonna do meth, and I'm gonna smoke crack or whatever. I'm gonna get high every day of my life. That's the difference.
So do you respond differently depending on which situation it is as the spouse?
I think the spouse probably, the spouse obviously needs to show some empathy. It's very hard. Like when I was struggling with anxiety, it was hard for Kandi to understand that. And then she started struggling, but she was very empathetic to me and very patient and very loving through the process when I was explaining to her things I was struggling with. That's a different struggle, but still similar. So I would say you want to be supportive, but there has to come a time, here's the thing, so here's the thing about an addiction. Every long-term addiction is the result of an enabler. Okay, I say this all the time. The enabler is someone who loves the family member. You love your husband, you love your wife, you love your mom, but you move from helping to hurting when you're supporting the addiction. Because what you do is you start paying for the rent and giving extra rent. So the only way an addict is going to get sobriety, or experience sobriety, is if they face consequences. They have to face consequences. They have to hit a bottom, okay? So if you're the enabler, if you're listening and you're the enabler and you're saying, my marriage, my husband's this, but I'm enabling, then you need to set healthy parameters in your life to say, I'm not going to put up with it. I'm not going to fund your death. I'm not going to participate in your addiction, and you're done. And you say, if you don't get help, I'm going to do this. I'm taking the kids, I'm moving out the house, I'm moving back with my parents, whatever. That ramps up his desire to get help. If he doesn't have that, bottom, he's not going to get help, because he can still connive you and cajole you to get money, and he can still manipulate you to get, support. But once he knows there's a bottom, or she knows there's a bottom, then they're going to get help. So the answer is, if they're battling addiction. Same thing with pornography. If you find your husband looking at pornography, obviously it's adultery. I mean, Jesus said it's sin in the mind. You can, obviously there's a lot of issues here, but let's say the husband wants to get help. You found it, I want to get help, I'm sorry. Then you're working with him to get him help, okay? Now, if he's saying, you're crazy, it's just pictures, whatever, that's a whole different ballgame. And there's counseling, and a whole different ballgame there.
Yeah, typically when you talk about enabling and addiction, it's in a parent-child relationship. But you're saying it could even be a spouse enabling the other spouse to continue.
I see that a lot, unfortunately. I see it a lot. We got that in our church. Some people I know personally, where the wife is the enabler, the husband is the addict, or vice versa.
And typically, do you find that having a biblical counselor come alongside that person, that spouse, to help them navigate where to draw those lines or where the boundaries are is helpful, or should they just figure that out?
No, I think counseling is always helpful.
Yeah.
I think most people in life could benefit from counseling. We all struggle with issues. And when you're navigating something that you've never experienced yourself too, you don't know really what to do. So you need someone that's helping you make those decisions.
When you're trying to balance out this commitment, this covenant that you have with this person versus boundaries, and drawing some lines about, if this happens, if this continues to happen, then this is what needs to happen.
Right.
So yeah, that's
addiction.
good.
You can almost walk the fine line of addiction being a form of adultery, in a sense, because you're finding satisfaction from something other than your spouse. There's a fine line there, but I would just say you deal with it like any sin. If that person is willing to get help, then you get them help, treatment, and a sponsor for accountability. That's the key.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this, somewhat related, but let's talk about someone being married to an unbeliever, and they are following Jesus. They're a Christian, but their spouse is not. Either they got married and that was already the situation, or one came to know Jesus after they were saved and the other is not. Does that change the covenant between the two? Especially, Kandi, you talked a little bit about what it means to be a helper.
Yeah.
Does that change if your husband is not a Christian, doesn't even follow Christ?
No, it doesn't. I'm thinking off the top of my head, but the calling of being a Nazaire does not change. How you show it may change depending on what you're dealing with, but a woman is always a Nazaire. That's how we were created from the very beginning, and that was God's design. So it doesn't change. It's just how you demonstrate that over the years will change.
Yeah, the covenant of marriage. So we know that even if you marry an unbeliever, it's still the covenant of marriage, because Paul gives a whole outline in 1 Corinthians 7 on what to do when you're married to an unbeliever. Because what was happening in Corinth was people were getting saved, the wife or the husband gets saved, more the women, because the Christian church movement back then was started with people who were normally poor peasants and women in the beginning, because the men were part of another religion. So long story, but at the time, kind of a new age kind of thing going on. But the women were the ones that first get it. So there was reason to believe that women were married to, so women and men were married. The woman gets saved, radically transformed, but the husband's an unbeliever. So the natural question was, okay, this was not a biblical marriage. Let me start over, hit the reset button and start over. And Paul said, don't do that. Paul says, stay married, and with your godliness and your righteous living in the home, you can win your unbelieving husband, 1 Corinthians 7, over to the Lord. So you would think he would say, that's not even a real marriage, recognizing the eyes of God, get rid of that and start, but he doesn't say that. So this is part of the consequences of decisions we made years before. And this is why, I mean, it's hard to share this with young couples. You need to wait. I know you feel like you're in love, but you need to wait and go to counseling and talk and think through all of these things. So my sister, perfect example. My sister goes to the Baptist church in Chattanooga. She knew this, married my brother-in-law, who I love and respect and appreciate, but he's Catholic, loosely Catholic. So he doesn't even really go to church. I mean, never goes to church, loosely Catholic. And so her whole time spent on Sunday is going to church by herself. He rarely ever goes to church, once, twice a year. And she goes to church and comes home. She goes to events and comes home. She reads her Bible and comes home. And she's trying to love and win him over, but he has no signs or showed no signs of fruit or repentance or any of that. So she just lovingly supports him and lives for the Lord.
So Paul, and that's several other questions about how do I'm a Christian, but my spouse is not. What do I do? Sounds like you're saying that Paul explained that by you living faithfully in this covenant relationship, contrasting that with ungodly marriages that are more contractual, you talked about that in the sermon today, that by you living that way, that will point them to Christ. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So you're not nagging, you're not demeaning, you're not negative. Yeah, you're going to hell. You know, you keep living. That's not
No.
what you do. It's the last thing.
And you have to fight that battle in prayer. I mean, you really have to pray. I mean, a lot of times, even in situations not like that, if there's something I'm desiring to see in Robby or wanting of him, and we've talked about that, but maybe it's not happening, you kind of have, like with the whole cell phone stuff. Like I told Robby for years and years and years, put down the cell phone. Like just put it down. Don't be so addicted to it or whatever all those things were. Never worked. And then I'm praying about it, and the moment the Lord tells him, guess what? He obeys immediately. And I'm like, listen, like that's what I'm saying. Like if I would have prayed about it a long time ago, I could have saved a lot of words.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But
Well, the Bible says we don't wrestle against flesh and blood.
and
Powers
that's
and
something like
principalities.
minimal compared to like what some of these issues are. You know, whether it's addiction or someone that's an unbeliever. But that's our greatest weapon is going to the Lord in prayer and fighting our battles in prayer about
Yeah,
those
that's a
things.
good point. Yeah, great point. Take your battles to the Lord. There's even a song. I mean, we talk about this all the time. But take your battle to the Lord.
Yeah.
So not everyone that is watching or was here today is married, but a lot of Christians desire to be married, or maybe they're in a dating relationship, and so there's a good number of questions about that. If I can ask you
Sure.
Some insights on that. Someone asked, what was the most important thing that you think you did before you were married to set your marriage up for success? Looking back, is there anything that comes to mind?
I mean, we did some counseling with Brother Don, who married us.
Multiple
We
sessions,
had
yeah.
Brother Tim and Miss Chris that were in our life, and so we talked with them.
Gary and Michaela was another couple.
Yeah, so we had a lot of couples in our
We had
life.
older couples in our life, because that's always been something I've always sought out counsel and mentors, and so we knew for marriage, why would we not do the same? So
You were already in seminary, Robbie.
I was, yeah.
So, Kandi, you knew he was called to ministry.
Yes.
Had you, sorry, Mike is still falling off. Did you feel a call to ministry? Did you already know, hey, when I get married one day, I'm marrying a pastor?
I did not know I would marry a pastor.
Okay.
I did know that I was called to ministry of some sort. I just had no idea what it looked like.
Okay.
But, you know,
Because I would think those having different futures, different goals,
Yes.
Yeah,
would
there's so many
have
dynamics
been
here.
Yeah.
a
And I mean,
red flag that this might not be the person.
Right. And I mean, at one point, when I became a believer, I think I definitely felt the call to full-time ministry, but I did not like tell anybody that or like walk forward and say, hey, I'm surrendered to full-time ministry. I had a full-time job in Baton Rouge that I really kind of envisioned being at for the rest of my life until I met Robby. And then, all that changed. And I wanted to just serve the Lord in ministry, however he wanted to use me. And so when I met Robby, it just was a natural kind of fit. But there were tons of things, I think, decisions that we made along the way that we might not have discussed up front. For instance, becoming a stay-at-home mom. That was not something that we had really talked about before. My mom had worked full time. His mom stayed at home with them until they were a little bit older and then went back to work. And so that was nothing that we ever really discussed, which I think needs to be discussed. And that after we had Rig, at that point in time, I was teaching, and Robby wanted me to stay home. And so I did. But then after I was home for a little bit, I was like, what am I doing? Like, I'm at home, like, wiping noses and bottoms, and I used to have a job, and I used to be good at my job, and I loved my job. Like, what's going on here, you know? And I had to kind of deal with that, some of those emotions, and like talk with him about it, because we had never really sat down and had that discussion. Like, hey, I want you to be a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
And it was obvious that that's what the Lord was calling us to do at that point in time, and we were able to do it, and so I did. But those types of things need to be discussed. I mean, like, you need to kind of talk about some of those things.
So here's a
that are,
perfect example about ministry. Let's talk about ministry. I'm thinking about this now. Is your call to your spouse greater than the call to ministry? Think about this. So let's say I was called to ministry, Kandi and I or let's say we married, and then I get a call to ministry. But my spouse is not called. She says, I'm not called. I'm not going to do that ministry. I'm going to work. I want to whatever. And we're all called to ministry, but I mean full-time vocational ministry. Okay. Do I continue to go after ministry and drag my wife along and say, you need to suck it up and do it? And my response is no. My response is no. Because your commitment to your spouse trumps the commitment and your calling to serve in vocational ministry, because you can always do ministry, obviously. But so what we ask at Long Hollow when we're interviewing, and we do this now, is we ask the husband and interview the husband, or we interview the woman, and then when we go to the spouse, if it's a husband or wife, we ask them this question: do you celebrate ministry or do you tolerate ministry? Because if you tolerate ministry, then your spouse does not need to be on staff. We want a partnership. We want two people striving together. Because you know as well as I do, it takes all of us, the whole family. And I can't have my wife going this way or my husband going this way, and I'm going. So yes, so what happens is now you need to, and we know somebody like this. They had to leave, get out of ministry, and go work a secular job, which is fine. And now they're happy. Their marriage is doing well, and so yeah.
So, and I know your relationship was a little bit different. Robby, you said you were 28, I think, when y'all got married. When you first began to date, was it with the goal of marriage or with that in mind? And I guess what I'm asking, some of the questions is, what should dating relationships look like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the point when Robby and I met, I had been a believer for a solid 3 years and was just trying to be really sensitive to where the Lord was leading me. And I mean, of course, I was dating and going on dates, but I knew I would know very early on, like, this guy's a joke, no way, you know, or this guy's trying to be a Christian for me. I wanted someone who was a Christian for himself, you know?
So would you break off that relationship when you discovered
Well, she
that?
did. She had a guy she dated.
Yeah, I dated
who
a guy.
said he was a Christian. Because everybody says they're Christian to go out with a good-looking Christian girl. So everybody wants to say they're a Christian. But she realized he wasn't a Christian when
he didn't go to church on Easter. And I got home and I said, hey, how was
That's a no-no.
church? And he was like, I didn't go. And I'm like, you didn't go? Like, hellions go to church on Easter. Like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, no.
slept in.
No, I mean, like, people who are bad, you know? Like, even bad people
we know,
go to
we
church
know,
on
we know.
Easter.
Non-Christians go.
Non-Christian. Yeah, that's what we call them.
And I'm like, and you don't go to church on Easter? Like, no, dude, you're not a Christian.
Yeah.
So
But we were in a different stage. So I'd say we were
y'all
later in
were a
life.
little older.
So it's a little older. When I was younger, I tried to think if I was like in college dating. I think it would be just different seasons. I would lay out some clear boundaries. Obviously, you want to save yourself from marriage. That's the best thing I tell young
Yes.
people.
You're talking physically, sexually.
Physically.
Yes.
Sexually, save yourself from marriage sexually. And then
Yes.
lay out some parameters here. I'm not dating just for the sake of dating so we can hang out, because I don't need a man or a woman to complete me. I'm
Right.
working on my relationship with the Lord. That's another thing Kandi and I did. She was serving the Lord faithfully. I was serving the Lord faithfully, and we were going hard after the Lord. We were like I show people it's like a triangle. We were both going after the Lord. And then what happens is when two couples start running to the Lord, they meet each other and one makes a beeline for the couple, and that's a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
You want to keep going after the Lord, and eventually you'll meet, so you keep going after the Lord. And I think that's one of the secrets to our marriage.
How important do you feel like friendship is in the dating relationship? should it be more of a courtship? Like, hey, if we're doing this, it is for the goal to figure out if we're getting married, or should it be more casual?
I mean, I think it depends on. I think your age depends this on this.
Hmm.
For me, when I met Robbie, I was 24, and I was not in the business or wanting to date somebody casually that was going to go nowhere, So I needed to know that they were a believer. I needed to
Mm-hmm.
hear their testimony. I needed to know they were legit. I needed to know he was a tither. I mean, there were certain things that were important to me.
You had a
She had
specific
a
I
list. She
list.
had a
did.
list. Yeah.
And I mean, I didn't come out with all that in the first night, but I wanted someone who was doing all of these things already for themselves and not going to do anything because of me. And so I needed a man. I needed a spiritual leader.
Mm.
And there was another thing. Like, I dated guys who were Christians, great
Mm-hmm.
guys, good looking, had jobs, nothing wrong with these people. But somewhere in that, I could not see myself submitting to their spiritual leadership. Like, it gave me the cringe to think about that.
Mm.
And the Lord was withholding something from that. I could have forced it and tried to make it work. I could have settled, and I would have completely missed out on what the Lord had for me.
Mm.
And so I think there are certain things that are important to you, that God would have for you and for your marriage, and you need to, especially if you're older, you need to make that clear. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to waste your time here,
Mm.
right? But as a younger person, I think it needs to be settled that, I'm saving myself for marriage.
Mm-hmm.
We can date, we're going to go to church. Like, those things need to kind of come out in the very beginning so that they know, and you're not pretending or putting on a facade. You need to be the real you, and then see what happens. I just think age kind of determines
Yeah,
what all, you know,
that's good.
you're going to
And
lay out.
another thing too is if you're getting sidetracked with people who aren't or someone you would think to be married to one day or spend the rest of your life with, then you're going to be sidetracked when God does bring the right person in your life, because you're going to be
Unavailable.
semi-committed, unavailable, because you're in a semi-committed relationship that is a dead-end relationship. When the right guy comes, you're going to miss him or her.
So even what I hear you saying, just correct
Right
me
for
if I'm
me.
wrong, is even if you may not be talking marriage with a date, that you should at least be thinking, is this person the type of person that
Right.
God would lead me
Right.
to marry?
Yes,
Right.
that's what I would say.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
there is a tone of seriousness to it, even if you're not getting emotionally tied to that person so quickly by talking about marriage.
And friendship is a part of compliment.
Yeah.
So a compliment is, I mean, when the heated love and intimacy, of the initial part of the honeymoon period, it's kind of like a honeymoon period in pastoral ministry and jobs. When the honeymoon period fades, you have friendship, and you share likes and interests. And this is another reason why empty nesters have a tough time in
Yeah.
their life, because they've raised their kids, but they found joy and satisfaction from the kids, and they vicariously live through the kids. Now the kids are
Instead
gone.
of each other.
Yeah, and they look at each other at the dinner table and like, who are you? They're like, I don't know who you are. We've been in the same house. We had coexisted. So they haven't nurtured the relationship. So
So someone asked this we over me concept. Should that also be applied to a dating relationship? And if so, how far does that go in a dating relationship?
I mean, thinking off the top of my head, I would say, unless you're engaged or married, I don't know if the we over me would apply, because there's a lot in that, and you're not necessarily that person's spouse, right? Yet.
You're
So,
not their helper if
right,
it's the
Right,
woman.
right.
right,
I mean,
right.
you can, yeah. So I would venture to say no. Like, the we over me would not apply unless you are engaged or you're married.
Until that covenant
Yeah,
is being
until that some
established.
kind of that commitment is made. That's my first thought on that.
and the commitment is made when the marriage, you have to be married. So even through the betrothal process, which even back in the first century was considered to be a form of marriage, you're not fully married until you're married, and,
Right.
and then you go through the ceremony and the process and the commitment to God. So
The two aren't becoming one until then.
yeah,
So
so
Someone asked, Candy, when you learned about Robbie's past,
Mm-hmm.
how did that impact your feelings towards him, or did it?
yeah, I don't I was never scared or put off or anything like that by his past. I had my own past that I was more concerned about him knowing. And then when we, discussed that together, I think we were both probably set at ease about, because I think he was a little nervous about me knowing his past, but I was not concerned about his past at all. And we've done a lot to put healthy boundaries, in our lives and in our marriage so that neither one of us hopefully would fall into any form or way or habit or anything like that. And we strive for that. Like, it's a big deal for us. And so we have made that a priority, and we have boundaries in our life. And so at the end of the day, I trust God way more than I trust Robby. And I trust Robby a lot. I mean, I trust Robby with everything. But above that, I trust the Lord. And so that's who I'm putting everything into. And if he allows something to happen, then I know it's his sovereign will, and, I'm going to go through it. So for me, I trust the Lord more than I trust my husband.
That's really,
And I mean,
really
that's
helpful.
that. It's like, that sounds good to say, but it's true too.
Yeah.
You really, I mean, I could not live this life, and I don't think many people could. And if they do, they have to be. It has to be so hard. But if you don't have the Lord,
Yeah.
like to put, that's
Well,
my
you don't know
person.
you don't know the author of love and the creator of love, and God doesn't just give love; He is love. So how can you be a channel or a conduit of love to your spouse when you don't know the person who disseminates and dispenses love? So that's how the marriage relationship works. As I receive love from God and compassion and forgiveness and reconciliation, I can then become an ambassador, 2 Corinthians 1, of reconciliation and redemption and love to other people. Most unbelieving couples, they don't have it coming in, so they're drawing from an empty well. And so you wonder why there's fights and
That's good.
difficulties and separation.
Yeah, that's good. Well, this is really helpful. I can't wait for next week. You said you're going to talk about communication and conflict. We have a lot of questions about that. I think people are very interested in what you guys fight over.
Yeah.
What does it look like?
Nice.
Who instigates the fights? Who settle? Like, what is your style? I think people want to know those
Wow,
things.
okay.
So
Wow.
that'll be interesting to hear you guys talk
Nice,
about
very
next
nice.
week. But if you're in the Middle Tennessee area, we'd love for you to join us over the next 6 weeks for this sermon series called Real Love. So thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us. If you still have questions, you can comment here at the bottom if you're watching on Facebook. If not, there's a telephone number you can text in questions, and we'll do our best to either address them in this forum or in another way. So thanks for joining.